what I'm concerned about for the United States of America is, as this corruption manifests over the course of the next 4 years or so, the people are going to become more and more radicalized because they're going to be pissed off, feeling the suffering from the corruption of the political class. That I'm really worried that we're going to arrive in the same place that Germany arrived at in the late 1920s, where they choose between hardcore communism or hardcore fascism. And I'm trying to advocate for this other alternative way, which is like a much less fucked up version of either.
No, and you don't realize how possible that actually is. So the Weimar's Republic, I had never heard of that until very recently. Do you want to kind of debrief
so
on
Weimar
what that
Republic
is?
was basically the government of Germany during the Roaring '20s, after World War I, and they printed the hell out of their money to the point where you had to have like a wheelbarrow of cash to buy a loaf of bread. It was that bad, and people were using money as wallpaper and kindling for fire. It was so worthless. And it was called hyperinflation. Right now we have inflation in the United States. They had hyperinflation where like every day the prices would go up 10%. And so the entire economy collapsed. And as people suffered, that was when the communists came in and people were really listening to communism, like maybe this is the solution because whatever we got going on right now doesn't work. And the fascists simultaneously came in and they were very anti-communist because it was a Jewish conspiracy in their mind. And the Jews were responsible for the failures of World War I in the Nazi mind, right? And the Nazis basically just won the argument, convinced the German people that, no, we don't trust these commies because they're Jews and we hate the Jews. That was the idea. And so we're going to go fascist, which is socialist. It's kind of got elements of communism in it, but it's not Jewish. It's German, right? And so that's what happened after the Weimar Republic collapsed. Basically, the Nazis were able to get a foothold. And it wasn't like the United States of America and Germany at the time. They had like dozens of parties. It wasn't like a left-wing versus right-wing thing. It's easy for us to think about it like that because that's what we're accustomed to, and we like to think about communist versus fascist. But there were like a shit ton of parties represented in Germany at the time. And what happened was the Nazis kind of eked their way into leadership, and all of the other parties were at a gridlock. And it was the Nazis were enough to just be so important to, shifting the vote either way on issues that they ended up getting all the leverage. And when the government collapsed, they were basically the only ones left standing, and so they just took it all. I mean, we're very close to experiencing, and I believe that history is cyclical, not linear. And so I think we see a lot of things repeat or at least rhyme. I think what we're seeing right now in the 2020s is very similar to what was happening in the world in the 1920s. And I'm very concerned that should we experience a collapse over the next 4 or 5 years, that we're going to wind up either choosing between being communist or fascist. And I really don't want either of those things.
And the main difference is just private business.
Yeah. So in communism, there is no private property. But in fascism, you still have private property rights to a certain extent, but the government controls all the major industry still. So it's not the same as communism because communism has this whole Marxist collectivist ideal behind it.
And fascism doesn't.
But fascism is more like what we actually have now, where you can start your own business, but once you reach a certain size, then the CIA reaches out to your censorship department and asks you to take down certain accounts, right? So when you have the Googles of the world changing search results, and you have the Facebooks of the world and the Instagrams of the world and Twitter before it was X, having meetings regularly with the CIA about what accounts or narratives to shut down, like that's basically fascism. Even though the government doesn't technically own the business, there's so much political influence over all of industry. And in fascism too, you have to keep in mind too that since banking was so heavily associated with Jewishness in the eyes of the Germans, they totally redid the way banking was done. So after the Nazis took over, they eradicated the ability for any bank to loan money on interest to anyone. The only entity that banks could loan money on interest to was the Nazi Party for the war effort. So nobody had any debt in Germany because you legally couldn't get any debt. They like totally shifted the whole thing. And so it's just wild how different things became. And honestly, there were a lot of good things about it for the German people. It was just too bad that Hitler and the Nazi leadership was so evil because they made so many reckless decisions that ultimately led to the entire destruction of their whole country. And like within the course of like 6 years, like they were fine and then they were all gone. And that's what bad leadership can do.
No, absolutely. And then it's also when you look to one person to solve all of your issues, and when something is so out of control, then you end up wanting someone who's really stern, because you're like kind of like with a child, like if something gets out of control, then you need way more discipline. And I think people look to government as like daddy government oftentimes. When I was learning about the Weimar Republic, and correct me if I'm wrong, because like again, it's still very new to me. One of my co-hosts on the other show that I do was saying it was like during World War I, basically, like a lot of the Jewish people stayed behind. They didn't participate in the war efforts, which comes back to like why a lot of the Germans were blaming the Jews for the lost war effort. But because they were so heavily involved with banking, that they were the ones that were getting a lot of the people that stayed, like the wives, the mothers, the sisters, into incredible debt. And then they legalized sex work, which was really like out of sorts for that, especially for that time. And then there was like a lot of weird gender stuff that was happening where they were kind of perpetuating gender fluidity and like trans stuff. So these people come back from war, and then like their wives are in debt.
Wives have mustaches,
and then
and then they're like really particular about their mustaches, and then suddenly they have the mustache.
Oh God! And then they all escalated from there, and that's the Weimar Republic.
So I think it's kind of correct, but also kind of not correct. So I believe that the claim that Jews did not fight in the war on behalf of Germany has been pretty much debunked.
Okay.
I actually think that if you were Jewish, you were more likely to be sent to the front, according to some of the studies that I've seen. I don't know what's true or what isn't. But I will say that after when the Germans lost World War I, the soldiers and the people were incredibly surprised. And it was sudden, and I don't believe that Germany had lost any territory. So it's like, how the fuck do we lose this war if we're the only country that hasn't lost ground, you know? And I think what happened was everybody looked around, like somebody from the inside must have like given the country away, because first of all, the Treaty of Versailles was trash. It was, Germany had to pay so much in reparations to the rest of Europe. It was like ungodly how much they had to pay. They were blamed for the start of the war, probably not even responsible. And it's like, we didn't even really lose. We didn't lose any ground. Like they were just like, what the fuck? So when they looked around, the only people that they saw that weren't really like German in their eyes were the Jews. Like, these are the only people among us who aren't like truly German, right? They must have been the ones responsible. Like, they're the ones that wouldn't give a fuck about us, right? And I think that's how it started. I don't actually think it had to do with a lot of these arguments against the Jews. I think came after the sentiment was established, and they're like looking for shit. Like, did you really go to the front? Were you really in the war? And yes, they were involved in banking, but I don't know. Like, you have to be careful. It's kind of like a chicken versus the egg, or egg. Yeah, which came first, chicken or the egg? And, which is, you know, pertinent because you have chickens now.
I do.
Right,
I do.
right.
Yeah.
And which came first? The egg, right?
The egg. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, I think that a lot of these claims about what the Jews did in the 1920s and after World War I were actually largely fabricated out of response of just distrust that the Germans had for anybody that wasn't German. But I could be wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not as anti-Semitic as some of my counterparts.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not pro-Israel by any means, but I only care about America. So I'm not going to spend any time hating or loving anybody else.